Our next speaker is Pam Aronson from the Department of Behavioral Sciences. Pam's a sociologist, and Pam's talk is titled Gender Differences in Definitions of Consent and Sexual Assault in the Me Too Era. Pam.
Okay, the title of my talk today, as Marty mentioned, is Gender Differences in Definitions of Consent and Sexual Assault in the Me Too Era. And my work is part of a larger project, which I'm calling Gender Revolution, Politics, Me Too, and Women's Power. And I'm examining the ways in which women are increasingly expressing agency over their own lives, including the Me Too movement and the rise of women in electoral politics. I have a number of research assistants on this project listed here, both students and former students, some of whom are working as co-authors with me on aspects of this project, and the presentation today draws on my work with the first student listed, Matthew Fleming. Regarding the topic for today, previous research has found alarming rates of sexual assault on college campuses. A survey recently that was conducted in Ann Arbor on our campus, about our campus, that portion of our campus, is found that 1/3 of undergraduate women had non-consensual experiences since their arrival on campus. To understand how college students are thinking about consent, assault, and harassment, I completed focus groups with 72 college students. And today I'm going to focus on just one main idea from my findings. So just know there's a lot more in terms of what my findings are compiling. In a moment, I'm going to show a diagram representing my theoretical framework and for understanding what participants said about gender differences in consent. And basically, there are two clear areas: yes, which represents affirmative consent, and no, which doesn't. Overall, men and women are on the same page there. Where they disagree is on this gray area, which is both confusing and contested in the Me Too era. And so, as we'll see, women interviewees consider this area a clear no, while men consider it a yes. And so when we think about what the women interviewees say, so I'm going to focus specifically on bringing the voices from the focus groups into this presentation. They discuss the way that both parties should explicitly, affirmatively agree to sexual activity. However, they report that men consider consent to be the absence of the word no, rather than the presence of the word yes. So for example, one woman said, "As a woman, you know what consent is. If you want to do something, you say you want to do it." She went on to describe men's confusion and the way that they pressure women. She said, "With dudes, it's like, okay, yes is yes, but then no equals yes, and it was like she's playing hard to get and she just wants me to try harder." Another woman echoed these thoughts when she said, "Part of the reason why there's just that misunderstanding of consent is because we're taught that there's a stereotypical way of saying no. But yes means yes, and we have to learn that everything else means no, if it's not explicitly yes." Several other women shared similar views on how men's and women's perceptions of consent differ. Another woman said, "Yes is yes, no is no, and there's phrases in between that may not mean exactly what you're hoping for, but it means no. And I don't think people should use that as an excuse, like, oh, I thought she wanted it." Like, no, don't think, listen. People will give you all the information you need. So here the phrase, "all the information you need," implies body language and verbal cues that are also important parts of consent. Another woman said that men and women think about consent differently. If we don't vocalize it, if a woman doesn't say no, they feel that they have consent. Another echoed these points when she said, if a woman doesn't explicitly say no, don't touch me, men don't understand. I don't even think that they know that they're committing sexual assault. So thus, for women that I interviewed, any ambiguous situation means no rather than yes. So in contrast to these clear-cut definitions which constitute affirmative consent, I won't get into that because there's no time, but California has a law, for example. The men interviewees described a lot of confusion over the gray area of consent. They used phrases such as extreme variance, black and white, textbook definitions, and hardline yes and no to describe clear-cut cases of rape. However, they use phrases like lower-level situations, lower-level things, gray areas, stepping stones, and smaller things to describe what they consider to be lesser offenses, ones that are more confusing interactions. In these situations, men see ambiguity rather than clarity. For example, one man contrasts what he called extreme variance with lower level situations, and he linked these different levels with male and female sides. He said, in the lower level situation, on a male side, if the communication wasn't there, might not be seen as something that would be implicitly sexual assault or harassment, whereas on the female side, it may be assault or harassment. Another man echoes these points. The more serious cases of sexual assault and harassment, it's a lot more clear. But when it comes to the stepping stones to these things, it's difficult to define exactly what these things were. Another man concluded that men just have a looser definition of consent than women. Another stated, a lot of women will be very textbook if something meets the definition of sexual harassment, whereas a lot of men are more laissez-faire. Another interviewee pointed out gender differences in definitions when he said that maybe what a female might consider overly excessive touching, I wouldn't view as wrong. Thus, most of the men emphasize the confusing and ambiguous gray areas that are often defined by men as consent. And so I do want to note here that there were certainly men who defined consent in affirmative consent terms, very similar to the women, but they were surprisingly in the minority of the men that I interviewed. So here, in conclusion, we've seen that men's and women's definitions of consent differ. Women view consent in affirmative terms. In contrast, men emphasize that there are gray areas and that men's definitions are more flexible than women's more strict, in quotes, textbook definitions. And this fundamental difference in men's and women's views of what constitutes consent represents a high-risk situation when it comes to sexual assault. So my research is revealing a disturbing gulf between men's and women's understandings and definitions of consent. And there are many, many other themes that my research uncovered that I obviously won't talk about today, including a perceived adversarial relationship between women and men, fear on men's part about what they called false accusations, and women's courage to come forward in the Me Too era. And I'm just going to conclude by saying that this gulf in understanding can be addressed and needs to be addressed through unambiguous state-level affirmative consent laws, which some states have enacted, and university-level affirmative consent policies. Thanks.